So welcome everybody to First Miami's Archaeology Discipleship Group. And as we've come all the way from the beginning, it's become a long way, all the way from an introduction to biblical archaeology to the beginnings of biblical Israel. And we've come all the way down through the Old Testament, pretty much covered most of that. And so I thought I would take the time today to just put together a couple of interesting kind of separate finds, which are both from Old and New Testament, and sort of some of the recent discoveries that didn't quite fit into some of my earlier talks or later talks. And so it'll be a relatively simple approach of just going through a list of several of these. And hopefully you'll find these interesting. And they do have very direct connections to verses and people in the Bible. So they're very pertinent to specific places in the Bible and people that are mentioned therein. So as I begin, I like to usually have a theme verse for this particular. This one's a little bit different in that it doesn't really have a historical or a theological theme, but nonetheless, the verse I'm using today comes when Jesus came in for his triumphal entry a week before his death. And it said, some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples." But Jesus answered, "I will tell you, if these become silent, the stones will cry out." So his statement means that even the stones will cry out in praise of him, even if his disciples were silenced. But in this context, I like to use it for the fact that the ancient stones, the ancient things that we excavate actually speak out into the truth of the Bible and to the truth of Jesus as well. So as an archaeologist, this sort of means a little bit something different perhaps. So we could give it a different spin and make it seem as if the stones themselves will cry out to the truth of the scripture. So this is the list of classes that we've had talks so far, from introduction to origins. We talked about the judges, the Philistines, King David and Solomon, Moabites and Israelites and Arameans in conflict. And the last one we had was King Hezekiah and the Assyrian onslaught, which was a specific event, probably the most best documented event in biblical history. And that is the invasion of the Assyrian King Sennacherib in 701 BC, in which he conquered most of Judah, but yet he wasn't able to take Jerusalem because King Hezekiah had prayed for his city to be delivered, and God delivered his city and kept it from being conquered by the Assyrians. Of course, later on, the Babylonians came and finished the job under King Nebuchadnezzar. But nonetheless, in 701, Jerusalem lived to fight on another day. So as we look forward, we have the latest discoveries today in biblical archaeology, and then we're going to start talking about some New Testament things, the beginnings of the church, which are very interesting and sort of cloaked in history and the shadows of time. Then look at the New Testament in coins, and then finish up with what happened with the apostles after the events of the New Testament in the book of Acts. So what did the apostles do after the Bible ends? Did they go out and evangelize the world? Well, it appears they did. But there's different stories and traditions about these apostles and what exactly happened to them specifically. All right, so we move again. I like to ground what we're doing here archaeologically in Scripture. And 1 Peter 3:15 is the call to apologetics. Sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you, yet with gentleness and reverence. So that making a defense is apologia in the Greek, and meaning make a reasoned defense for it, not to apologize for it, but to advance it in terms of reasoned defense. And Jude 3 calls upon us to contend earnestly for the faith which was once and for all handed down to the saints. And finally, I like to appeal to you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. So we want to engage our intellects and our cerebellums in also to evangelize and to advance the gospel. So for those of you who are more interested and want to delve in a little bit deeper into these biblical archaeological things, there are 3 magazines that I recommend. One is called Artifacts, and this sort of scans the headlines of the newspapers and picks up biblical archaeological stories. and gives you just a little newspaper treatment of them. If you want to go in deeper into them after that, you can do so. But I find this very useful because I'm not always reading all the newspapers. So when things are announced, sometimes they come up in the popular press before they actually come up in the journals. So this is a good way for me to stay on top of things. Probably the most important and popular magazine is Biblical Archaeology Review, which has great articles, great photography, diagrams, schematics, reconstructions, and it's written by those who are actually working in the field. So it's a good, very good popular magazine. And then Bible and Spade, which is the magazine that I started working in archaeology with the Ministry Associates for Biblical Research, and they put out this magazine once a quarter and has all kinds of biblical archaeological topics. And if you go to the actual website, biblearchaeology.org, you can find almost any biblical archaeological historical topic you could think of, and there's articles there for you to be able to reference. So another great reference. So we moved to our first artifact, and it is a tiny one. Now, anytime, of course, we find anything that's written, it's of special significance because we have so very little written inscriptional forms from the land of the Bible. Now, on either side of the land, we have Egypt, and we have a great civilization in the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, valleys that began with the Sumerians, the first literate civilization, and then the language coming down known as Akkadian, using the script called cuneiform, was the language of the Assyrians and the Babylonians for many, many centuries. So we have just a treasure trove of inscriptions from palaces to annals of the of campaigns of the various kings of Assyria and Babylonia. So in that area, we have a huge number of inscriptions. And then down in Egypt, we have a huge number of inscriptions going way back to the early 3000s BC in the picture language, and it was hieroglyphic Egyptian. And so that went on for thousands of years. So we have all of the great temples in Egypt, and also scrolls and stuff that have been preserved in the Egyptian language. But in the middle, in between those two great civilizations, what's often called the land between, there's not very much. So when we do find something, it generates a lot of excitement. Now, this particular little bulla is an impression created by a bulla onto a wet piece of clay. And it's a tiny little piece. It was found, it dates to about 700 BC, and it comes from Jerusalem in a sifting project. About 20 years or so ago, the Muslims began an illegal excavation on the Temple Mount to build a new mosque. There are several mosques on top of the Temple Mount today. And they did it by night, and then they took some 20 or 30 truckloads of material and then dumped it off into the Kidron Valley, not too far away, and then covered it up with trash to try to cover up what they had done, because only under a mutual agreement between the Jews and the Muslims is any work allowed to be done on the Temple Mount. So obviously it's a very sensitive topic, a place, probably the most sensitive place in the world. So it's meant to be kept as it is unless both sides agree that you can dig up stuff. But they went ahead and did it anyway. And there's a huge pile of debris then that a couple of scholars began to go through and sift. And they're still sifting today. You can actually sign up and go sift through all this material if you want to. And they're finding all kinds of interesting things. And that's where they found this particular bulla in 2012. And it comes from the time during the reign of Hezekiah, Manasseh, or Josiah. It's a bit difficult to be more specific. And it, as you can see, there are 3 lines from top to bottom, and partially broken as well. But what we can read from it says in the 7th, so it would be in the 7th year, or a year of the reign of one of these kings, and each one of these kings had at least 7 years, so we can say that with confidence. Bethlehem in the 2nd line, and then the 3rd, Melech, so that's king. So it gives us a little bit of information there, not as much as we'd like, of course. It's the first time that Bethlehem itself appears outside of the Bible on an inscription. It's probably some sort of a fiscal administrative document used to seal some kind of shipments of silver or agricultural produce, such as wine or wheat, that would have been shipped to the capital from the provinces the outlying towns. And Bethlehem is only a few minutes south of Jerusalem. Again, it was found in 2012 by the Temple Sifting Project, and here it shows how they go through bucket by bucket. They wash it with water, all the dirt off of it, and then they go through every little piece of whatever they find. And they found lots of little pieces of all kinds of things over the past few decades now, and a couple of inscriptional finds like this one. So the name, actually, Bethlehem, means in Hebrew, house of bread, but it could very well be derived from something earlier from the Akkadian Mesopotamian language, the god of fertility, Lechem, which was news to me. So it possibly means that at the site in Bethlehem, there was a temple to the god Lechem. Now, when they did some excavations down in Bethlehem, they found a number of tombs and pottery that date from the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, but as of yet, they haven't found any structural remains, any real architecture. But it's enough to establish the fact that there was a city there at the time when this bulla would have been written. Now, the earliest mention of Bethlehem outside of the Bible, which is actually even earlier than this bulla, comes from the Amarna letters from the 14th century BC, when the town was inhabited by Canaanites. And these were letters, these Amarna letters were written by kings in Canaan who were subject to the king of Egypt at the time. And they were writing letters back to the king of Egypt, asking for help in various things that were going on in between the kings, and also a renegade group known as the Apiru, because in this case, the governor of Jerusalem, whose name was Abdu-Hepa, was appealing to Pharaoh for help in taking back the village of Bethlehem from the Apiru, which could have been the early Hebrews. It sounds very similar to Hebrew or Apiru. This has been an ongoing dispute as to whether the Apiru mentioned in the Amarna letters were the original Israelites coming into the land and starting to make trouble for Pharaoh and for the various Canaanite city-states. But this could be an example of that. Excuse me. Here's a picture of Lachmu, known as Hari. This is a Mesopotamian god of protection from demons, often placed in house and building foundations. So like a talisman, sort of a good luck charm that would have been put in a foundation deposit below a house or some sort of a temple or something like that. So in the Bible, Bethlehem has several interesting parts of its history. In the Old Testament, in Genesis, it's associated with a place called Ephrata. It could be an alternate name for Bethlehem. And Mike probably knows has sort of that name because it's a name of a city in the state of Washington today, isn't it, Mike? Ephrata. And it was on this way where Rachel died and was buried. Now, descendants of Judah apparently settled here as well, such as the family of Boaz. So in the book of Ruth, we have in the valley to the east is where the Ruth of Moab gleaned the fields and returned to town with Naomi. We also know it as the home of Jesse, the father of King David, and the site of his anointing by the prophet Samuel. And one of my favorite prophecies, which is very interesting, because before this bulla had ever been excavated or discovered, I wondered, was there a city in Bethlehem contemporary with the prophet Micah in the 6th century or 7th century BC? And the famous prophecy goes, but as for you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you one will go forth for me to be ruler in Israel. His goings forth are from long ago, from the days of eternity. So it appears obviously that there's plenty of evidence for it, and we've seen it this morning. This is also, of course, the traditional birthplace of Jesus since the time of Justin Martyr in about AD 155. And it was originally marked with a church during the time of Queen Helena in about 326, the Church of Nativity, which is still there today, a later version of it. And there's a picture of it right there. So we move to our second discovery, and this is probably the newest discovery because it only came out about 2 months ago, called the Jerubbaal inscription. Now, you may have heard of the in the book of Judges, the judges by the name of Gideon. He's one of the most famous of the judges. And in fact, there's more written about Gideon than any other judge other than Samson, the very famous Samson and Delilah. And in Judges chapters 6 through 8, we have the story of Gideon. Now, to go back to the period of his judges, this was still a time when they lived in their tribal allotments. So they were not living as a nation state yet, and they didn't have a king yet. They had what were called judges who would arise for a time to lead the people against their enemies. And then once the crisis had been solved and things were back to normal, the judge would go away and then they would go on. There was sort of a cycle of judges called the judges cycle, where Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and then they were oppressed by the people around them, like Midianites and other peoples in the land. And then God would arise for them a leader, a judge, to lead them back into out of oppression. And then they would do what was right in the sight of the Lord. So this was a cycle that went up and down and up and down numerous times during the book of Judges. So this is the setting for this particular inscription in the time of Gideon. So we have some rather funny looking cartoons, but just to give you something to look at, we find Gideon, Israel was doing what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and they were being oppressed at this point by the Midianites. So we find young Gideon here trampling wheat in the wine press when the angel of the Lord appears to him and really calls him into action. Now, at first, of course, Gideon can't believe what he's seeing, and the angel says to him, "The Lord is with you, O valiant warrior. Go in this your strength and deliver Israel from the hand of Midian." But of course, Gideon isn't ready for this, and he can't believe what's happening. So he asks for a sign. So he gives a small sacrifice, and it's burned up by the angel of the Lord, which indicates to Gideon that indeed he has been visited by the angel. And so he is called upon then to tear down the altar to Baal of his own father, who apparently was a Baal worshiper. And this was, of course, one of the Canaanite gods, the chief of the Canaanite gods, and then his consort known as Asherah. So you'll often hear Baal and Asherah linked together in the Old Testament, where the Israelites were falling into idolatry and worshiping these foreign gods. So Gideon takes one of the bulls of his own father, a real bull, and he sacrifices it on the altar of Baal, which is Baal is symbolized by a bull, and he destroys the altar and cuts down the Asherah that's beside it. So here's a little pictorial representation of that. And so he's given at that point the name Jerubbaal, that is to say, let Baal contend against him. So this is something that means apparently there's an outrage, of course, that this has happened, that Gideon has destroyed his father's altar, but his father essentially doesn't proclaim judgment on him. And he says, well, let Baal contend with him. So essentially, it's out of my hands. So he becomes known as Jerubbaal in the Bible at that point. So then the story goes on, and he asks for a sign, the fleece, the famous fleece, where in alternate episodes he asks God to keep the fleece wet and everything else around it wet with dew, everything else dry, which is produced, and then alternately it's kept dry and everything else is wet with dew. So he's confirmed once again that the angel of God is with him, and he's now going to lead the Israelites against the Midianites and out of oppression. So another very strange part of this story of Gideon is that then he goes out to look for his army, and to select his army, he's told to, you shall separate everyone who laps water with their tongue as a dog laps, as well as everyone who kneels to drink. So here's a couple of depictions of that. Excuse me. And so what emerges from that are 300 men, only 300, in which he takes them to encircle the camp of the Midianites. And then he develops a ruse by where they have these torches in empty pitchers, and with also equipped with trumpets. At night, they encircle the camp, and then they smash the pitchers and they blow their trumpets, and they win a victory. It sounds a little bit like Jericho, in fact, when they blew the trumpets there and won their victory. So that is the story of Gideon, known as Jerubbaal. Now, where was this inscription found? Well, down here in the south of Israel, not too far from Philistia, this little place called Khirbet al-Rai, which actually, this was very exciting to me when it was announced, because I actually had a chance to dig here a couple of years ago, and I know the director there quite well. And so he told me a few months ago that they had found an inscription, but yet it wasn't publicized yet, and he couldn't tell me what the name was. But then shortly thereafter, the name did come out. So this is an aerial view of the site of Khirbet al-Rai. A khirbet means just a ruin. It's unlike a tell, which has an accumulation of debris which goes many, many meters high, an artificial hill. A khirbet or khirbet is just a very small, thin layer of ruins, of ancient ruins. So this is a site today. It's part of like a national park preserve, which has been replanted with trees, groves of almond trees and other types of beautiful trees. And so you see here the site, fairly small, and we'll blow it up a little bit. And there are only 3 excavation areas here. And the one over here on the left in the shade of the trees is area A. This is where they found the inscription. And now we blow it up and look aerially right down onto the actual excavation area. And this dark area down here is a pit. Excuse me. So here's a nice picture of the pit. You can see it's stone lined. Now, pits, of course, were common in the ancient world for throwing garbage. And when we find a pit, it's usually means we're going to find lots of interesting things that had been thrown out as the garbage by the people in the ancient city. So when you start to dig down through that pit, then you find all kinds of stuff. So what they found here was an inscription. And there were 3 fragments of a pottery jar, and 2 of them joined together, and one of them doesn't join, as you can see a small piece over here on the left. But these 2 pieces joined very perfectly, and they put them back together here. And they found several letters. The first one is only partially preserved, and that's the Yod. That would be the Yerubbaal, the J or the Y. And then a Resh, a Beit, an Ayin, and a Lamed. So these are the letters going from right to left. Now, if you read them from left to right, it would be YRB, Ayin El, Yerubbaal, or in the English, Yeru or Jerubbaal, which, as I said before, means something like let Baal contend against him. So the question is whether is this really Gideon's inscription here? Now, these jars would often have names on them because it would just mean the name of the owner. So oftentimes it would be belonging to, and then a name would follow. We don't have the belonging to part of it, but it does have the name. Interestingly, it dates to about the time of Gideon in the book of Judges, about 1100 BC. So archaeologically, this is datable to that time period. Also, it's the inscription is in Proto-Canaanite. So this is an early form of Canaanite, which then would have, of course, also been used by the Israelites, this written language. So whether it's the actual Gideon, we don't know. Now, the events of Gideon and the events of which we talked about in the Bible took place up in the Jezreel Valley in the north of Israel. This is in the south of Israel. Doesn't mean, though, there couldn't be the actual Jerubbaal or Gideon, but without further information, it's impossible to know whether it's really him. But interestingly, this name is only common in the Bible during the period of Judges in the very early part of the history of Israel. After this time, it's not used at all. So it's another interesting coincidence that we have this name exactly when we would expect to find it biblically. So either way, whether it's actual Gideon or not, it's still a pretty amazing find. So now we jump into the New Testament with what is known as the Pool of Bethesda. Now, as I've found over the many years, all of these names in the Bible, oftentimes we have names of American cities that are named. There's a Bethesda, Maryland, that some of you may know about. And growing up, I had no idea that these are all biblical names. I even grew up in a biblical city name that I didn't even know at the time. The name is Berea, and it's a suburb of Cleveland. And there are several Bereas around. There's a Berea, Tennessee, I believe. And this was another name of a biblical city I didn't even realize when I was growing up. So Bethesda is another name that we find in America as a modern city name. This is just a nice little painting of the miracle that took place here at the Pool of Bethesda. That's actually at the Church of St. Anne's Chapel in Jerusalem, which is a French Catholic property. Now let's locate this in terms of Jerusalem today. You have the Temple Mount here in the upper left-hand corner, and you can see up above that a couple of blue pools. There's a pool of Israel, and then up here there's a double pool. That's the pool of Bethesda. Excuse me. Now this, excuse me, is a reconstruction of what it looked like about 2,000 years ago. We have the Temple Mount. We have the Fortress Antonia, where the Romans had their presence overlooking the temple. Here's that pool of Israel right at the northwest corner or northeast corner of the Temple Mount. And then the pool of Bethesda, this double pool, this sort of colonnaded, roofed in area with two pools, one above the other. And that's significant because archaeologically, now here's what it says in the book of John. Now in Jerusalem by the sheep gate, there was a pool, which in the Hebrew is called Bethesda, having 5 porticos. In these porticos lay a multitude of those who were sick, blind, limping, or paralyzed. That's in John chapter 5. And here's a depiction of the event. Now a man was there who had been ill for 38 years. Jesus, upon seeing this man lying there and knowing that he had already been in that condition for a long time, said to him, "Do you want to get well?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. But while I'm coming, another steps down before me." Jesus said to him, "Get up and pick up your pallet and walk." Immediately the man became well and picked up his pallet and began to walk. Now this is a modern scale model of Jerusalem, which is at the Israel Museum today, and you can see the crowd of people behind it. You can walk all the way around this model and look at it from the outside looking in, and it's a marvelous scale model of Jerusalem in the first century, and it reflects mostly a reality of what we know archaeologically of what it looked like and where the buildings were located during that time. You can see here the Temple of Herod over here on the left. Here's the Fortress Antonia with these huge towers, 4 of them. And then you have this beautiful pool, there's a double pool, pool of Bethesda. Now the 5 porticos are exactly what we expect to find with a separating one. If you think of this as 2 different pools and then a separating portico in the middle, a 5th one. So 4 sides and a 5th one that divides the 2, but they're actually 2 different pools. And here's a nice perspective on them. Now in the Aramaic, it means house of mercy or place of flowing water. There was a northern pool that goes all the way back to the 8th century, and it was originally begun as just a dam and a reservoir known as the upper pool. So the water would come down this valley and it would be caught up in this upper pool, used for a catchment of water for drinking and other purposes, I'm sure. And then the lower pool was added later in about 200 BC. And in the 1st century BC, it may have functioned as an Asclepion, that is a Greek healing temple. Recent excavations suggest that this was actually a mikveh. So the 2 largest mikveh ever found in Jerusalem are the 2 that we're talking about today, the pool of Bethesda and the pool of Siloam, which we'll talk about in a minute. Now there was an upper pool here, which was fed by, it was called an otzer in the Hebrew. And an otzer in a mikveh, of course, was a ritual cleansing pool. And these pools were located around the temple so that when people came up into the temple, they had to ritually cleanse themselves in the mikveh, the water pools, before they could go up into the temple precinct itself. So there were large numbers of pilgrims who would come, so these were some fairly large pools. The upper pool, the otzer, could only be fulfilled ritually by fresh water that was given by, quote unquote, the hand of God, naturally by way of rainwater, stream, or river. And then in this particular case, it fed the lower pool, which is where the people would go in then to ritually cleanse themselves. So a large public mikveh, and there were others in the area as well. So this would have accommodated the large pilgrimage crowds for the 3 great festivals known as Passover, of course, Sukkot, and Shavuot. So this is what it looks like today. It's underneath the grounds of the Church of St. Anne's, and there's all kinds of later ancient construction over the level of the original pool. So it looks, you have to look deep down into a trench, and you can see a little ladder there. It's physically possible to go down in there, but they don't have it open for people to go and visit. But you can see some of the stairwell here down in the lowest part of the picture. And this was my attempt to try film a little video. Whether it works, okay, so the audio just doesn't work for me in these presentations, but you can see that I'm looking over my shoulder, trying to get a good shot of it, and talking about what I've just been telling you about, this mikvah of the Pool of Bethesda. So that is the Pool of Bethesda. And you can visit it today in Jerusalem by going to the Church of St. Anne's, and there's a large area that's open, areas of excavation from mostly later periods of time, because after the Roman period of time, this then ceased to become later on a mikvah, and it just became a place of veneration for the Christian church. And so they built a church over top of it, and a very early church, and then later on other versions, and then later, of course, right up to today, with the Church of St. Anne's over the original site. So now we talk about the Pool of Siloam, which is the other major mikvah in the site of Jerusalem. And this one is located south of the Temple Mount. This also connects into what we talked about last time with the King Hezekiah and his Hezekiah's tunnel. So we're looking again at the Temple Mount, and then to the way down to the south, you have this Pool of Siloam. Now there's a modern village here called Silwan, which is derived from Siloam, and it's this one and the same. So up here you have the temple way up here on the top, and then you have, if you recall from the last talk, we talked about King Hezekiah in anticipation of the Assyrian siege and army coming to take his city, cut a tunnel through the solid rock from the Gihon Spring, which is located up here, in order to secure that water source inside his city, because it was in a very vulnerable part of, and exposed right here where the Gihon Spring emerges. And then he cut the tunnel down through solid rock down to the bottom and secured it within the city walls of the time. And this is the Siloam Pool. So the water flowed, and it flows downhill into the Pool of Siloam. And this was going back to the time of King Hezekiah. But now we're talking about a New Testament or Roman period construction, a later version of it, which they only discovered actually by accident. They were working on some kind of sewage pipe, and they found the water started flowing down here, and it actually uncovered this Roman period pool, the Pool of Siloam. And this is what it looks like today. It's not fully excavated because part of it is still in a church property to the south, to the right in this picture. So it's only less than half excavated, but you can make out the outlines here of a nice, what it actually is, a trapezoidal shaped pool. And you can see nice stairwells or stairway here and landings. Some of it's got to be reconstructed because the stone has been taken away. But you can see a nice, and here's me trying to talk about it again, whether you can hear it, you can't really hear it, but I'll just play the video. This is just from about 2 weeks ago. And they've got it nicely excavated. You can see the dirt over on the right. That's the unexcavated part of it. And you can step down into it and take a look at it. It's a long pool, originally about 225 feet in length. This is what it might have looked like originally. Here's a nicer version of that with people around it. And so what happened here was Jesus said, while I am in the world, I am the light of the world. And when he said this, he spat on the ground and made clay of the spittle and applied the clay to his eyes. This is a man who was blind, and said to him, go wash in the Pool of Siloam. So he went away and he washed and came back seeing. Therefore, the neighbors and those who previously saw him as a beggar were saying, is this not the one who used to sit and beg? And in fact, it was. So this is actually a shorter presentation. So I have actually finished up We've talked about the bulla from Bethlehem, the seal impression that mentions Bethlehem for the first time outside of the Bible on an actual inscription. And then we talked about the Jerubbaal inscription. The judge known as Gideon was renamed Jerubbaal. We may have the inscription with his name on it. And then we have the two very famous healings by Jesus in the Pool of Bethesda and the Pool of Siloam, both of which have been discovered in recent years. So with that, I will end the presentation and remind you that the next First Miami Archaeology Discipleship Group talk will be on Sunday, October 10th, in which we'll talk about the beginnings of the church. And if you want to look further on the website, visit firstmiami.org groups to learn more about First Miami's Archaeology Discipleship Class series, and also about other church groups that we have available online. And that is the end. So